All right, we're live. This is the Difference Makers podcast. Today we have with us Brian Friend. Brian Friend is the writer for The Morning Chalk Up. He's a co-host of the Sevan Podcast, and he's just an all-around CrossFit statistician. So welcome to the show, Brian.
Thank you, Justin.
So I want to know how you got started in all of this. How did you come to CrossFit? How did you become this CrossFit statistician?
Yeah, it was it started as just a hobby. I had some friends drag me to the gym in 2013. I ended up participating in the Open in 2014. Just kind of that's everyone was doing it at the gym, and I thought it was kind of cool. Obviously, saw some of the big names on the leaderboard and realized that this was just the start of a season for them. That year, the regionals was here in Chicago on Navy Pier, so I went to it. Kyle Casperbar won that regional that year. And then I watched the games, and that was Rich's last year, Matt's first year. It was kind of a big year for the sport. And I've always had this, I always do these little fantasy sports or, competition things with my friends. And I did it that first year. I just made up this system, made up this thing, and we all drafted. That year we only did men. I think it took us 2 years before we started also drafting the women. And then I followed the games. In the off season, I was like, wow, well, there's got to what's the history of this sport? So I just started watching all the old documentaries, all the old events on YouTube, the behind the scenes stuff that Sevan had done. And I started reading some of the journal articles that Greg had written in the early 2000s. And basically, just to keep it brief, for the next 3 or 4 years, I was probably spending somewhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours a day digesting old CrossFit information.
Yeah.
Somewhere along that timeline, I got my level 1. And then when Sevan started the CrossFit podcast in 2000, I don't know when he started, 2017 or 18. In the 2018 Open, they did a segment called Trolling the Leaderboard. And I was like, this is my stuff right here. Because in the meantime, what I'd been doing as I started to learn more and more was trying to find out why the media wasn't covering the sport so as well as I thought it could be covered. And really what I mean by that is that they were doing a great job of covering a few athletes, but the rest of the athletes that I also knew were working very hard to get there. And sometimes for some of those athletes, it would be a heat win, would be the culmination of years of training.
Yeah.
And they'd cross the finish line and I'd watch and the announcer wouldn't know their name or the MC wouldn't know their name at the competition. And I was like, it's not right that someone in Heat 2, Lane 7 just won this event and all they're getting recognized as is the athlete in Lane 7 wins the heat.
Yeah.
So I was always looking for a chance to shine some light on more of the athletes and not just the elite athletes, but maybe some team athletes, teenagers, masters, whomever. And so he was doing this Trolling the Leaderboard and I was like, oh, this is great. He's going to dive into the leaderboard of the Open in ways that people aren't doing. And I listened to the show and I was very, very disappointed. And I was like, man, I'm looking at the leaderboard and I see all these awesome storylines. And so I was like, you know what? I'm just going to take a chance. And so I popped up on Instagram, sent Sevan a DM. I said, man, I love this idea, but you really screwed it up in week 1. You could have talked about this. You could have talked about this. One of the things I pointed out to him that week, I remember, was for the CrossFit Mayhem team in 18.1, they didn't even use Rich's score as one of their top 2 scores for men on their team because Dre Strom had beat him in that workout. And Matt Fraser, who was listed as part of their team when he was training at Mayhem, had beat him in that workout. And I was like, you could have talked about this, gave him a couple other examples, and he responded to me. And I was surprised he responded at all. And he just goes, damn, impressive. Send me more. So the next week I sent him some more and I'm watching the CrossFit podcast and he pulls out 3 sheets of paper and he goes, well, guys, some guy on Instagram, Brian Friend, sent me his notes. So we're just going to use his notes for the show today. I haven't read them yet, so hopefully they're good. And I was like, what the heck? And I'm just watching this back in Florida where I was living at the time. And, he's like, this is great. Send me some for week 3. So I said on week 3, after week 3, he's like, I want to fly you out for week 5. We'll have you on the show. I was like, wow, that escalated quickly.
Yeah.
So I flew out to California for week 5 and Sevan wasn't there. He'd been summoned by Glassman to do whatever.
Oh.
Instead, Tommy Marquez was like the guy he appointed to greet me at CrossFit
Yeah.
HQ. And I'm like, Tommy Marquez, like, he's kind of the guy I want to be, you know?
Yeah.
He's the guy who's paid to know about all the athletes. I think I know a lot about the athletes, but it's his job every day to know as much as you can about this sport.
Definitely.
And he goes, yeah, man, I'm going to be on the podcast with you. And I was like, what? So Matt Bishop ended up hosting the podcast, and Tommy and I did the podcast. And it's like my first time doing this, first time in CrossFit headquarters, first time publicly speaking about this thing that I've been more or less studying for 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
And I was a little nervous, but after a few questions, I would realize that I could, at the very least, like, not embarrass myself. And so the podcast went on. I think it was okay because they invited me to regionals that year as well. And then we started doing some podcasts at regionals, but it was more trial by fire. I just assumed the podcast would be him asking me things about the athletes or the regional. And the first night he's like, oh yeah, by the way, we have a guest on the show, and it's Pat Vellner. And I'm like, wait, what? He goes, yeah, we're going to have a guest every night. I said, oh, okay. So I'm just like, whatever.
Yeah.
Pat Vellner night 1, Ben Bergeron night 2, Katrin Davidsdottir night 3. So it's like you're like thrown into it.
Yeah.
And honestly, after I did that, I was like, okay, like, for whatever reason, I can do this. Like, I feel comfortable talking to the athletes and the coaches. I feel comfortable in front of the camera. Like, I'm not nervous. And I think it was just, I'd spent so many hours learning about this stuff.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, my mind could just recall it, that I was prepared.
And that's just all from taking a shot at it and just throwing a DM to Sevan and giving him some tips that you researched.
I try to give him credit for that, and he always throws it back on me and says, "No, man, you did all that work. You created those opportunities for yourself." But yes, if he hadn't responded to that, who knows?
Definitely. Hey, that's just creating opportunities for yourself. That's amazing.
And really, it's been a lot more of that in the subsequent years.
Yeah.
I ended up going to the games that year, and we were going to do a podcast there, but then we were told we weren't allowed to do it. That was the year that all the media, basically Glassman canceled all the media at CrossFit anyway. Yeah. And so he'd shut down some stuff beforehand and a bunch of stuff afterwards. So I ended up going, but all the things that I was supposed to be doing were not going to happen. So I was just there with my brain and my knowledge, but nowhere to put it to use. And actually, Tyson Oldroyd was super helpful and friendly that year, and he gave me some opportunities to work with the media team. And I'm actually pretty excited that there is going to be a 2018 documentary coming out, because I got a chance to be a part of that team. And knowing what I know now 3 years later, and having worked at all these events and gotten to know a lot of the people who create content in the space, that was pretty much like at that time, at least, that was like the all-star cast of videographers and photographers working under Tyson that year at the games. They were kind of all in. He'd rented like 12 red cameras, and all the big names were there. So I think that the storytelling was really had the potential to be really good, and I'm pretty excited to see that one come out.
Yeah, that'll be a big one. That's the infamous behind, or the story of the games that never happened. That 2018 games documentary, for you people that don't know out there, just was canceled when CrossFit fired their media staff. That was the year that it just never happened. And a ton of content is out there around that year.
And a lot of people think it's one of the best years. So some people think it's like the culmination of an era before the legs were cut out from underneath it, which, the media team was all basically let go. So it should be pretty good. And just kind of knowing what I know about how we worked that year. And like I said, Tyson was like, he was pulling the strings and making it happen, and gave me a chance to be a part of that. But as a result, I met a lot of people at the games, and a lot of the people that I met, and some in particular that I met there, have been relationships that have allowed me to have opportunities in the sanctional seasons, and then transfer those opportunities into subsequent, going back the next year. They would tell another director, hey man, this guy knows his stuff. You should talk to him, reach out to him, see how you can help you. And it was always just in the interest of getting more coverage for the athletes, getting more opportunities for them. Because I think, if this sport is going to succeed as a sport in the way I think a lot of people want to, it has to be viable and sustainable for the athletes, and not just for the top 5.
I couldn't agree more. That's one of the questions I had for you is, what do you think what is it going to take for this sport to be viable for the athletes, not just for the top 5 or top 10 or whatever that might be. This year we saw some of the top, especially women, not compete, but they're, by not competing, how much could that affect their bottom line, right?
I think it's kind of a transitional period in the sport right now where there have been agents in the sport representing athletes for almost 10 years now, maybe like 8 years was when the first ones really started coming around. And not a lot of people necessarily know them or know who they are. But even this year, I would say they're becoming more and more recognizable. And those guys are working hard to make, and I don't say guys, there might be some women agents that I don't know about, but there seem to be mostly men, are working hard to create opportunities for the athletes to make money and earn a living off the competition floor. Now, obviously, they need to, compete and do well enough to get those opportunities. And I'm sure there are incentives built into their deals if they do well at the highest level of competitions. But if a year comes up like this, like happened for Sarah Sigmund's daughter, where she has a freak injury that keeps her off the competition floor for a year, or like the story was with Annie Thor's daughter when she got pregnant and that company Noon was willing to support her through the pregnancy. Those are important things for athletes, in particular female athletes who might have children, to say like, yeah, I can have a sustainable income if I miss a year for whatever reason. Because otherwise, sometimes you have that thing happen, you miss a year, and it's like that's the end of your career because I had to go get a real job.
Yeah. And there's a lot of athletes out there. You're starting to see that their agents they're agents, but they're able to support themselves. Like they don't have full-time jobs.
And so that's trending in the right direction. I think probably another big milestone will be if a major TV deal is signed. And I would, I'm not involved in any of the background talks or anything like that, but I would imagine that being something that is not just even limited to the game season. Because if you think about what are the biggest draws of the year, it's the games, but then it's probably Rogue and Wadapalooza and Dubai and maybe a couple of the semifinals. But those fields are more diluted. The semifinal fields are more diluted, and they're all in one weekend. There's 3 of them at the same time, so it's a little bit different if you're trying to sell like to a big TV company that you want to cover the semifinals. Then if you say like, well, what if it was the Games, Rogue, Dubai, and Wadapalooza? That's 4 big events that are like isolated events on those competition weekends. That can, a big deal like that can bring a lot of opportunity into the space as well.
Now, with CrossFit in the position that they're in, having the games, kind of at the top, and these other companies, Rogue, Loud and Live, do you think there'll be ever a way that they can come together to form something like that, or are we going to see this separation continue to exist?
That's a tough one to kind of project, because in the past couple of years when there was more uncertainty surrounding CrossFit HQ, all the things that happened with Greg, obviously selling the company. The games were very different in 2019, and then they were kind of forced to be different in 2020. A lot of people were starting to wonder, are the games are they losing their edge? Are they losing their position at the helm of the ship or whatever? And will some other company or organization come in and create a different season that's going to be kind of take the reins going forward? And then when the company was sold and Rosa came into play, it kind of seemed like CrossFit got back on track, and they were like, no, we're still here and we're here to stay type of a mentality when it comes to the sport. Rosa's very pro the sport of CrossFit in addition to just the methodology. So I think that at this point, and I always think about, when people ask me this question, I always think about Ray Kroc and McDonald's. And he was like, he didn't want to buy their franchise and name it Crocs. The name is important, and the CrossFit Games it carries something with it, regardless of who's running it or who's organizing it. Just having the name, the CrossFit Games, the fittest on earth, that goes a long way. If I just showed up with X amount of money and put on some event, I might get the people there, but I don't think it would have the same prestige necessarily or lasting power that the CrossFit Games and the fittest on earth has.
Yeah.
So I think that it's more likely that they'll find a way to coexist and hopefully create an ecosystem where they can all coexist successfully, and that the events and CrossFit and the athletes can all, improve their opportunities to, make money and grow as a, I guess, a more cohesive entity. I think that's what makes most sense, but we'll see.
I think you're right there. Like I'd like to see something cohesive like that does have these features, feature athletes, feature competitions. The thought of a competition series leading up to the games was something that, there's like, I look at like the X Games in extreme sports world, how there was, there's the X Games and then there were different branches of it. And then there's things like, I forget what it's called now, but I think it's called the Do League skateboarding, where they have like several competitions that all accumulate with a championship.
Yeah, the tricky thing in CrossFit is how many competitions can you realistically do every year and do well if you want to be an elite performer in the sport. I've in the past year or two, I've developed a hobby for disc golf, and I've drawn some parallels as I follow the professional disc golf season compared to CrossFit season. But the very, very notable difference is you can play disc golf every weekend at a very high level. Just like you can play golf every weekend at a very high level. And just like you can skateboard every weekend at a very high level, obviously in all cases, barring injury, but you cannot do high level competitive CrossFit every weekend. It's impossible. And so that's one of the questions that people are always asking is, well, what is optimal or even possible for the best in the world in terms of number of competitions they can show at and show off their potential in a 12-month period. And that's where it's like kind of the gray area right now. And, some of the athletes that did well at the games this year have talked about this and the possibility that it might be more if you're finishing 15th at the games, like how much have you invested already in terms of time, commitment, prize monies, registration fees and travel expenses and everything else just to get there to place 15th. 15th at the games is great, but what's the pay? What's the payout? It's not that much.
No.
$10,000-$15,000 or something like that. But if you just say, well, man, I'm not going to spend 8 months training for that. And even if I like maximize my potential, I make 15 grand. I can change my season around. And while everyone else is preparing for the games, I can focus on Dubai and Wadapalooza. And I can go to Dubai and Wadapalooza while everyone else is in their off season. I'm going to be peaking. Maybe I take 5th at both competitions. And now I'm making 10 times money, Maybe I make 100 grand between those two competitions with the different incentives and stuff that they have built in there. Even if it's 5 times as much, even if you make 50 grand instead of 10 grand, suddenly that's a sustainable income for a year.
Yeah.
And that's not, of course, not counting any potential sponsorship deals or whatever else. I'm just talking about on the competition floor. But those, you have to think that there are athletes that are thinking like that. Like obviously the ideal is to win the games, but only one person can win the games. And if you start looking at the prize pools, once you get past 10th, like you're not making that much money at the games.
No.
And it's a lot of investment to get there.
Once you go past 20th, you're not making anything.
Right.
So that's a tricky thing. Now with the future of CrossFit and the athletes, what do you think the next 2 to 5 years is going to look like? Like we've got guys like Yonakoski, BKG, who are mid to late 20s, but they've also been around for 5 to 7 years. Do you think that we're going to see those guys continue to stick around and stay relevant, or is it going to be a big push for this younger generation, like led by Justin Medeiros and those kinds of guys?
Yeah, it's Yonakoski and BKG are interesting examples because it's kind of like Tia Claire Toomey and Brooke Wells.
Yeah.
And obviously Tia's had a little more success than the other three, or a lot more success than the other three, but they're all 26 to 28 years old and have at least 6 years of games experience already under their belt.
Yeah.
And that's pretty substantial when you look at maybe some people like Lazar Jukic comes to mind. He's only 25. He's only a year younger than Yona, but this was his first year at the games. Yona's been there 6 times. So they have similar age, totally different career paths to get there. I think that there's going to be over the next 10 years, there's going to be a gradual decrease in the average age of the games athletes. And if it's 28 right now, which I'm not 100% sure that that's the number, but I think it's right around there, that it'll slide towards 25 or 26 over the next 10 years. So it'll be small changes over time. I do think that there'll still be the potential for people to be relevant into their early 30s.
Yeah.
I still think Vellner and Fikowski, if they want to, can be relevant for 1 to 2 more years, probably. And by relevant, I mean like threatening for the podium at the games, which is what they've done, for the majority of the last 6 years. And but I think it will be harder and harder as time moves on, because you'll have more guys who are in their 20. For women, I'd say it's probably like 20 to 25, and for men, it's like 22 to 27, where that's going to kind of be the sweet spot of the best athletes. And then obviously it'll be a smaller. I think it's going to be very difficult to find 10-year games athletes 10 years from now, if that makes any sense.
Yes. No, that makes total sense.
Like even if you think about Haley Adams, like, okay, this is her third year at the games. By the time she's Tia's age, if she's made it every year, she'll already have 10 years experience. But what's the total toll on the body? How long is that sustainable from a mental perspective? Emotionally, does she get distracted with who knows what, a family or whatever else kind of opportunities come up?
Yeah.
And I think that, and in the meantime, if you just especially look at the women that are 16 to 20 right now, there's like a dozen of them that are incredible. And you have to think that that's just going to continue to happen over the next 5 years.
Yeah. For those of the listeners that don't know, Brian just put out a list of the top CrossFit athletes under 25, male and female.
And there's a lot more young, like 16, 17, 18, 19 women on that list than men.
Yeah.
Most of the men are 2 to 4 years older than that.
Yeah. But that makes sense from a development standpoint. Most sports are like that, where women will develop a lot earlier and peak a lot earlier.
Yes, for sure.
Who do you think has the potential to dethrone a Tia-Clair Toomey? Or I'll use Tia as an example on the women's side. We'll start there. Who has the potential to dethrone?
It's not that fun of an answer, Justin. I don't think there's anyone who can beat her for at least 2 more years. And for someone to beat her, and this is obviously assuming she wants to continue to compete for that long, but I think that if she's committed to it, she'll win the next 2 years, barring injury, pretty handily. And I think that, the reason why I kind of picked that 3-year mark is because the person that I think has the next best chance, and there's one big if here, is Haley Adams. But she has to get stronger. And so far, what I've seen is that she hasn't really been able to get that much stronger in the time that she's invested. And I don't know her training, in a supreme amount of detail. But in 2019, she couldn't lift the first bar of the clean event. And in 2021, so 2 years later, she couldn't lift the first bar of this event 7, which was the second wave of clean and running event.
Yeah.
And it's like, man, 24 months have passed. Like, what? You haven't gotten 5% stronger in 24 months? Like, that's concerning to me.
Yeah.
If for whatever reason that's able to change for her and she can get, I think, maybe 15% stronger in the next 3 years, then I don't think there's any holes in her game. She's world class, and by world class I mean podium contender in everything else, in every other domain, including mental fortitude and tenacity and grit. And she has a great training environment that she likes, which I think is important. So she's the person that I think has the best chance 3 years from now to win the games right now. But a lot can change in 3 years.
A lot can change. And what about on the men's side? Do you see Justin Medeiros as being somebody who has the potential to make this run of these great athletes? Or, like, I think this would have been one of the closest podium finishes in the last few years, at least.
Yeah, if you're just looking at the points margins, 2019 was closer, but that was kind of an anomaly I think that was a outlier example. And obviously Fraser's been very dominant for a while. This is the first year since probably 2010 where I'm not sure if the man who won the CrossFit Games is the fittest man alive.
Yeah.
And it's definitely nothing against Justin Medeiros. That weekend, he was without a doubt the fittest person there, or fittest man there. And Vellner's talked about it. And I've talked about it, like every time that he needed to do something in the back half of the weekend, Medeiros, he did it. And a lot of times he like exceeded it. I saw the yoke event. I was like, oh, Vellner's going to crush this. And he got second. Medeiros was third. I saw the deadlift handstand push-up workout. I'm like, Vellner might win this. He did. Medeiros was second. It was like, and then it comes to the final, and it's like, man, if you're Vellner and you're standing there, and in the last 3 workouts, Vellner coming into the final, Vellner had taken third, second, and first. Now, we know he made some mistakes earlier in the weekend, and I'm not talking about event 1. He's been very open about it, that the stretch of 6, 7, and 8 was where he left all the points on the table.
Yeah.
Now you're standing there and you're like, my God, even if I win this final workout and I beat Justin for 4 straight workouts in a row, I need 5 other guys to beat him just to, to have a chance.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing, like, if you know Medeiros at all, there was nothing that was a great workout for him. He was going to he was not going to get worse than 5th on that workout. And if you're looking at the fact that Pat lost by 85 points or something at the games this year, I think that, and I haven't asked him this, and I don't think he's gotten to it in his recaps yet. Maybe he has today. I haven't seen it, but I think that he just kind of knew at that point, I just need to finish this workout and I'm going to get second. Yeah. Because Brent's too far behind me and Justin's too, he's just too good. He's not going to give me the opportunity. So I don't think Pat, was trying to win that workout. I think he was just like, I'll just accept my fate at this point.
Yeah.
But I don't think I answered your question. Medeiros, I think, has the potential to win again.
Yeah.
And I think that it would be foolish not to mark him right now as the man to beat. But I'm really excited for the potential of him doing hopefully one off-season competition, maybe Rogue, maybe Dubai, maybe Wadapalooza. I don't think it makes that much sense for guys like that to do more than one of those.
Yeah.
And definitely not to do all 3. But if he shows up to it and he doesn't win, now there's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So it's, it might be a safer play for him not to show up to any of them and try to defend his title next year. But I don't think he'll do that. I think he believes in himself. I think he believes in his training and what him and Adam are doing. And I think he'll want to go out there and have fun. I think he enjoys competing and he enjoys challenging himself. If you were putting me to it right now, I would probably, I don't think he'll win next year, but I do think he'll win again at some point.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. I like that take. I like that take a lot. I think he impressed me this past games, and not just because he won, but by how he won and just his consistency. And you're right. Like the freestanding handstand push-up event. Oh, he just came in second place. Like he just did really well. He was right there on the yoke. Like I know events that Pat's really good at. We've seen Pat compete at the games for years now. And those are the types of events that Pat does very well on. It's kind of odd object, just like the rope climb ski erg earlier in the weekend. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Justin was just right there every event.
Yeah. I mean, and you look at his worst events, I think it was a 15th and I think it was in the 550-yard run. It's like, I'm not worried about it if the 550-yard run is your bad event and your 15th, by the way. So yeah, Justin was phenomenal. He was very impressive to me. I was pulling for Pat because I feel like his window to win is smaller. Justin's 22, Pat's 30.
Yeah.
But as the weekend wore on, I was like, it's hard not to root for this guy because he's showing up and doing what needs to be done every time. And he was a worthy champion this year for sure. And I think every man in the field will acknowledge that too.
I think so. Now I had a question for you. What were your favorite performances of the 2020 games? And kind of, like Annie was one of those.
The 2021 games?
2021. Did I say 2020?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, 2021. But yeah, like Annie was one of those ones that stood out. Justin winning for the first time kind of stands out. But what were those ones that kind of flew under the radar that people might not realize?
Okay, I'm gonna get a little bit more granular and talk about specific events, if that's okay.
Let's do it.
I think it was event 2 for the men, heat 1, and it was Samuel Cornway.
Yeah.
He came into the games very, what people might say, cocky or arrogant, and talking about how he's going to beat Pat and how he's going to win and how people aren't giving him credit for being 10th last year, even though it was online. He earned that spot and he'd improved this much from the previous year and everything else. And I was like, okay, man, like you're talking a big game. I know you've been training down in Mayhem for a couple of months, but like you have to show up and show me that this is not just a bunch of words flying out of your mouth, and that you can actually do something impressive.
Yep.
And the swim and kayak, people are going to have their capacity in that event, and that is what it is. But that next event was a very difficult, demanding event, and he crushed that heat. And I think he ended up taking second in the event overall. I think maybe Pat beat him in the next heat.
Yeah, Pat won that event.
Yeah. And I was like, oh shit, maybe Samuel Cormier is going to be a contender this year. Now it sounds like he got sick and we were never able to really see his full potential in any of the rest of the events. But if that is a glimpse into what his actual capacity is, then mark him down as someone to watch next season.
Okay.
And it's probably not a moment that many people will be drawn to, considering everything else that happened on the weekend afterwards, but it was not lost on me. Overall for the men, I would say just the general performance of Saxon Panchik, similar to at Granite Games.
Yep.
He just is really remarkably consistent. The longer time domain stuff is a little bit of a problem for him still relative to everything else, but it's not as bad as some other people's holes, if you will. And I think he's, again, he's 25 years old, and he's got, he seems to have a really good head on his shoulders. He's really happy with his coaching and training environment. I think we're looking at a perennial top 5 contender for the next couple of years in Saxon Panchik. And he's kind of gonna slot right in, right where his brother used to be. Maybe even he'll make the podium. Like, he's that good.
Yeah.
So for the men, that would be one specific and one kind of general. For the women, I will never underrate her again on an event like this, but I completely forgot about her prior to it, and then she went on to win the event. And it's Emily Rolfe in the event number 10, the running and toes to bar workout.
Yep.
And of course, we know she won the ruck run in 2019, but it's like the ruck run to me is a little bit more of a specialty thing. She's a little bit bigger than a lot of the women that competing, just a little taller, a little broader shoulders, and it just makes sense that if she's a good runner, that she'd be better at running with a ruck than someone like Kristi Aramo or Kristen Holta.
Yeah.
But I didn't think that would be the case when you took the ruck away.
Mm-hmm.
Now it was just running, and then you have to throw in 90 toes to bar. And you've got people like Sam Briggs, whose cycle rate on toes to bar is best in the world. And you still have Haley Adams, who's amazing at toes to bar and a good runner, and Kristen Holta and Kristi Aramo and Tia Toomey. And I basically predicted the top 5 women in this workout -1, and it was the overall winner, and it was Emily Rolfe. So she's, generally speaking, Carol-Anne Riesen-Thibault has been the one to beat in Canada. It wasn't unable to compete this season or see the entire season through. And so Emily Rolfe is now the fittest woman in Canada, 15th this year at the Games. Yeah. And she's got 2 event wins in her career in those long time domain running workouts. She's obviously world class in that kind of an event. So, and I don't know that many people have talked about that. So I wanted to give Emily a little shout out there. And then from kind of a more general perspective, man, and the women's side is tough. This is tough to pick, but I think I'm really impressed with Kristi Aramo. And I'm like kind of tempted to say Kristen Holta, but I think more people have talked about how impressive what Holta did this year was, and just the total summation of her career with her retiring and everything. But Kristi, I mean, she had to go through the last chance qualifier just to get into this competition. And she was in the top 5 for a majority of the weekend, ends up finishing 8th, which is her career best finish. She's now, I can't remember if this is her 4th or 5th year at the Games, but she's never been worse than 13th there. I think this is her 5th year.
Yep.
That's pretty impressive. And I don't think that a lot of people, when they think of Kristi Aramo O'Connell, they're like, yeah, she's a Games athlete, but I don't think they think of her as a multiple time top 10 Games athlete. And this is her 3rd time inside the top 10 at the Games. And she's starting to string together a pretty impressive resume over time. So those are my picks, I guess.
I like those. I have it on, I don't know if you know this, but I have it on pretty good authority that Emily Rolfe before that event was pretty sick the whole day before. I don't think she ate very much.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the kind of bummers or tragic things about the Games this year is it seemed like a lot of people were dealing with some kind of illness, and there's speculation about maybe being from the lake. Who knows, with everything that's happened in the world this year, and obviously a couple of athletes at the Games did have run-ins with COVID of different varieties. They were unable to compete or see out the competition. And so, obviously in an ideal world, we'll have the best there and all of them healthy and fit and ready to perform. And that was probably like the biggest bummer this year is that, it's not that far of a stretch to say that 5 of the top 10 fittest women in the world didn't get to finish the competition, and some of them didn't even get to start it.
Yeah.
But that's sometimes how it goes, and that you can't take anything away from the women who did finish out the weekend. Like, it's not their responsibility that Cara Saunders got COVID. It's only their responsibility to show up and finish the weekend in the best that they can do, and that's what all of them did. But when it's just crazy. Like, you think Katrin Davidsdottir took 10th this year. Well, Sarah Sigmundsdottir wasn't there. Jamie Simmons wasn't there. Cara Saunders, Carrie Pierce, Bethany Shadburn, all of whom have top 10 potential.
Yeah.
Like, could we have seen Katrin finish 15th with the same performances if these other 5 women had been able to compete? And now you're starting to say, wow, the women's field is extremely deep and extremely competitive.
Yeah. It's an impressive thing to see how far the sport has come and how competitive that both fields have become.
And sometimes it's overshadowed, right, by the dominance of a Fraser or a Toomey. But when you strip back the layers a little bit more, yeah, man, in my opinion, Karen Freyova should have been at the games this year from Europe. She was 6th in the Lowlands Throwdown, and all 5 of the women that beat her placed 13th or better at the games.
Yeah.
I think she would have finished inside the top 8 at the games if she'd been there this year, but she wasn't even able to make it through the European semifinals.
That's just how deep they are.
Yeah.
Now, I just want to circle back and just say that Emily Rolfe, that wasn't COVID. That was something else.
Yeah.
It wasn't COVID. But coming back to what you said, do you think the qualification process should be altered to allow for some of these regions to be more well represented?
I think yes, but there's some context to that, and I'm actually working on a study right now to try to illuminate this thought a little bit more clearly with some data behind it, because I have like these inklings and instincts about certain stuff, but when I like to look at the data and see if it actually supports the theory. But prior to this year, I did do a study because CrossFit's method selection process right now is based on open registration or participation.
Yeah.
And I wanted to look at elite level performance over the past several years. Mm-hmm. And when I did that, on the women's side, it was suggestive that the women in Europe have, based on their competitive performance, earned 13 spots at the games instead of 10.
Okay.
And this is, in this method, it's also considering the fact that every continent will still get 1 spot. So there's been nothing until this year with the men in Latin America that suggested that either South America, not Latin America, that either South America, Africa, or Asia should have more than 1 spot at the games. So that leaves 37 spots in this method. And I think that, I can't remember if maybe Oceania women were had done well enough to get 5, and then the European women had earned 13, and then the remaining ones were for North America.
Yeah.
But when I look at the Oceanic women's field, at the start of this year, I said, well, if Tia and Cara and Jamie compete there, why is anyone else even bothering to show up? You're not going to beat them in a 6-event weekend long competition, and you only get 3 spots. Well, that means that Madeline Sturt, 4-time games athlete, Laura Clifton, who's been great these past 2 years, Ellie Turner, who's a young up-and-comer in the sport who needs some opportunities to compete against women outside of Australia if she's going to be the next thing there. They have no chance to make it to the games. Yeah. And luckily for them, Tia didn't compete there this year, and Jamie was injured this year, so it was just Cara took one of those spots, and then 2 spots were open, and they were able to go and get some competitive experience at the games. But, if nothing changes for next year, then we're not going to see Maddie Sturt back at the games. We're not going to see Ellie Turner at the games again, even though they're good enough to be there and compete there. The process won't allow for it. Maybe they could get last chance qualifier, but last chance qualifiers are very difficult. Those, if you scroll through the list, there's 10 to 15 men and women on that list that you're like, holy cow, I have to beat all of them.
Yeah. Those rosters were very deep for men and women.
So I have a thought of a proposed system. I've explored it more on the women's side than the men's, because I think that there's a stark disparity. The men in North America are still dominating. Yeah. And of course, there's a couple exceptions to that, the BKGs, the Koskis, this year, Guimayeros. But for the most part, North USA and Canada men are dominating the competition in a way that the women are not.
Yeah.
And so I think that if you were to take, I think maybe take 3 spots from North America women and give 1 extra to each of the European semifinals and 1 extra to, 4 spots, because there's 4 North American semifinals. And if you took 1 for, let's just say Lowlands, 1 for German, 1 for the Oceania, and then 1 extra for last chance qualifier, that you would get a stronger total women's field at the games.
I agree with you there. I think you're right.
I feel like the 6th best European woman in each of those semifinals, the 4th best Oceanic woman, and the 3rd best last chance qualifier would overall do better at the games than the 5th place finishers from each of the North American semifinals. And if you look at who those would have been this year, well, it was Jessica Griffith, but really it would have been Christine Kohlenbrander, and we don't know how she would have done. But Jessica Griffith, she's a phenomenal athlete, didn't do that great. Reagan Huckabee didn't do that great. Carolyn Connors didn't do that great. And Atlas Games, which was kind of like a weird competition anyway, where there were like 9 women within 20 points of each other. But I think the last one in was Sydney McAlishan, and I think she did the best of all of those that I listed at 25th. But like I said, I think Karen Frey could have gotten 8th or better at the games. Yeah. And if, Maddie Sturts placed 19th and 21st or something like that in her 2 best years at the games. So I don't know. Those are my thoughts, I guess.
Right on. You have a very elegant way of putting everything. I appreciate that.
Well, thanks, Justin.
How, you've kind of said how you've amassed this knowledge, but how have you gotten so deep on some of these athletes that nobody has ever, I say nobody's ever heard of, but outside of their bubble, they're not known in the game space that well. They're not known in the training space. How have you done your research to find out about these athletes?
Do you have a friend who's like amazing with movies? Like he just knows every actor and actress in every movie, or if you say an actor's name, he can tell you like his whole IMDb history. I have friends like this, and I'm like, how do you guys know that stuff?
Yeah.
For whatever reason, that's how it is with CrossFit athletes for me.
That's you.
When I see a competition and I look at the leaderboard and I look at the results or whatever, like it could be 2 or 3 years pass by and then a name pops up and I'm like, I know that name from somewhere. I think they were at this competition, and I'll pull it. And sure enough, they were there. And I can't explain it. But in addition to that, I do a lot of work on my own. So there are people who create spreadsheets that have all this information about athletes competing at competitions and then send it out to the broadcast team and the videographers and the MCs and the directors and whoever needs the information. But in my opinion, the person who created the information is the one who actually knows it well. Yeah. All the other people, then it's up to them to do a lot of work to understand how to use that information for their job. And so usually I'm the one who's creating the information and then sending it out to these different groups and walking them through how they can best use it to tell the story that they want to tell, depending on what their responsibility or job is. And so I haven't done that for dozens of competitions over the past couple of years. That's just like every time I do it is this exposure to another list of athletes. And, usually there's like, I don't know, 20 to 50% of the athletes, I already know who they are very well. Yeah. They're the regulars, which leaves another maybe 50% of new names and new faces. And if Justin, how do you say your last name? Tamani pops up in one competition, okay, that's great. But if it pops up at a second competition later that season, now I'm recognizing it. And by the time I see it for a third time, I'm like, okay, I better know who this guy is. So that's just kind of like the crude process of how it happens. This year, as more people have gotten to know who I am, more people on Instagram have reached out to me and said, hey, man, I train with this guy or this girl, or I've seen this person in competition and you should have him on your radar. And I never ignore those comments, but a lot of times I'll respond and I'll say, why? So like some guy told me before the Torian Pro, hey, man, you should have your eyes out for this guy, John Champion. And I was like, well, why should I have my eyes out for John Champion? Yeah. And they never responded to me. So I didn't have my eyes out for John Champion. I saw him when he competed and I saw how he did. And he was middle of the pack there in Oceania. But I was like, this person's telling me I should look for John Champion, but he's not giving me any reasons why I should believe in this guy. Yeah. And so it usually, if you reach out to me and say, hey, I know so-and-so, then I want to know what do you know about them? Because if it's worth knowing about them, then I want to tell the world about them if I have the chance to. And if not, then they'll show up to competition and they'll make a name for themselves anyway.
Right on. I know you're a busy guy. I know you got a lot going on, so I'm going to leave you on that one. But where can everybody find you?
For the most part, I'm just on Instagram, Brian Friend CrossFit on Instagram, and on the Sevan Podcast, we try to do several episodes a week. Write for the Morning Chalk Up, a couple articles a week, typically. Those are the main spots.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Brian. Thanks for joining us. This has been the Difference Makers Podcast, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Hit that like button and subscribe down below for more content coming soon from WODProof.